happy to welcome the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, this morning. Everyone here, regardless of political views, understands that the FDIC, the Fed, and the Treasury Department are putting in long hours to contain the fallout of the recent bank closures. The process is moving forward under existing law. Investigations are underway at the SEC and the Department of Justice. Senator Brown, chair of the Banking Committee and a valued member of this committee, is determined to get to the bottom of exactly what went wrong. Nerves are certainly frayed at this moment. One of the most important steps the Congress can take now is to make sure there are no questions about the full faith and credit of the United States. That means paying the bills incurred by presidents of both parties and taking a default off the table. With respect to the budget debate, after a request from myself and Senator Whitehouse, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office did the math on the recent fiscal promises we've heard from House Republicans. The promises pile up, but the numbers don't add up. They wish to balance the budget in 10 years, but they've announced a long list of untouchables. No reductions in defense, no cuts to Medicare or Social Security, no touching veterans programs, no asking the wealthy or corporations to pay their fair share. A couple of these items could get bipartisan support, certainly not all of them. Senator Whitehouse and I asked the Congressional Budget Office to run the numbers. Is it even possible for Republicans to stand behind those commitments? Does the math add up? Madam Secretary, you and I have talked about this. The numbers don't add up, not even close. What the Budget Office found is that for Republicans to make the math work, they'd have to cut every federal program by 86%. Goodbye to Medicaid and the guarantee of nursing home coverage, which I saw when I was director of the Great Panthers. The border would be unprotected. Roads and bridges would crumble. If Republicans wanted to extend the Trump tax law, they'd have to cut everything else. Given that, it's not a big mystery why House Republicans haven't yet put a budget on paper, budget to show the public. They're living way, way out there. Democrats are following a smarter approach. The president has put out a budget that's based on a simple proposition. Help working families, help the middle class get ahead, reduce the deficit at the same time, and show that these matters are not mutually exclusive. I'm just going to highlight a few budget matters that are important to the Treasury. First, last week, the committee had a very good bipartisan hearing on affordable housing. This is an area where I believe there's a clear opportunity for bipartisan cooperation. The budget proposes expanding the low-income housing tax credit, creating the neighborhood homes program, and other ideas. Senator Cantwell, Senator Cardin, Senator Young, they're championing bipartisan efforts. I'm going to work with them closely on these proposals and more. This crisis needs a solution. There is no substitute, and you and I have talked about this as well, Madam Secretary, for increasing supply of housing. Second, the budget calls for expanding two of the most significant sources of support for working people and families, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. When the Congress passed these expansions in 2021, there were huge, almost immediate reductions in poverty. With a little bit of help, millions of working Americans felt like they could breathe for the first time. I'd like for them to have that feeling of relief once again. And third, we've talked for a long time about the need to address the basic unfairness of America's two-tiered tax system. One set of rules for people who work for a living, firefighters, nurses, teachers. They pay their taxes out of every paycheck. Then there's another set of rules for the very wealthy who can pay what they want, when they want to, and for years on end, little or nothing. Although the President and I have proposed slightly different ideas for addressing the unfairness, we are rowing in the same direction. One final issue. I have got serious concerns about the administration's approach to implementing a portion of the Inflation Reduction Act that deals with sourcing critical minerals. Free trade agreements cannot be unilaterally decided by the executive branch. They require consultation and consent from the Congress. That includes any agreement on critical minerals. Secretary Yellen, thank you again for being with us. I know you've got a hectic schedule. We're going to have a wide-ranging discussion. We look forward to question and answers, and I understand that you've got a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so we'll all try to keep them short and get to questions. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to today's hearing, Secretary Yellen. I appreciate your appearing before the committee in this timely manner following the release of the President's budget. While the budget is the focus of today's hearing, I expect that the emergency measures that have been taken this weekend by Treasury, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC will also be appropriately discussed today. It's important to learn more about what initiated the run on Silicon Valley Bank, the impact of the Federal Reserve holding interest rates low for too long, and what steps were or were not taken by the SVB and the banking regulators. In the meantime, I'm concerned about the precedent of guaranteeing all deposits and the market expectation moving forward. Once started, moral hazard, like inflation, is not easily contained and does long-lasting damage. Inflation played a key role in the recent bank failures as rising interest rates and mismanaged interest rate risk led to a liquidity crisis. Indeed, there is no issue more critical than the unacceptably high inflation that American families continue to face every day. Americans have now experienced 16 months of inflation at or above 6%. Costs of rent, groceries, and services continue to rise. Wages cannot keep up. Last year, the administration committed to working in a bipartisan fashion to address this serious problem, noting that the budget must complement monetary policy. Instead, what we've seen is a reckless tax and spend agenda that was forced through Congress, rolling out trillions of dollars in debt finance spending and hundreds of billions of dollars in new tax increases on U.S. job creators. The Congressional Budget Office says the Inflation Reduction Act will not only increase inflation in the near term, but Treasury will collect less corporate tax revenue with the partisan IRA in effect, despite being sold as a bill to make corporations pay their fair share. The Federal Reserve is having to compensate for this by growing interest rate hikes. Rising interest rates are impacting household budgets, the federal government's coffers, and as we saw this week, our banking system. The President's budget demonstrates the administration has not learned from its mistakes. After 2 years of policies that contributed to record high inflation and excessive deficit spending, this administration is doubling down with this budget with more of the same. The spending binge must stop. We must address our growing deficits in order to put the United States finances on a sustainable path, and pro-growth tax policy should be a part of that solution. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act led to one of the strongest economies in generations. The TCJA introduced competitive tax rates while broadening the base, including by enacting the first global minimum tax of its kind and putting an end to corporate inversions. It also contributed to record high corporate tax receipts, both nominally and as a share of gross domestic product. But instead of considering bipartisan pro-growth policies, the President's budget includes a whopping $4.7 trillion of new and increased taxes on American job creators, which ultimately means fewer jobs and lower wages. It also includes higher taxes on American energy producers. Earlier today, Senator Barrasso and a number of his Republican colleagues, including myself, sent a letter to you, Secretary Yellen, raising concerns with the over $100 billion in increased energy taxes proposed in the President's fiscal year 2024 budget. And Mr. Chairman, I ask that this letter be included in.
Without objection, so ordered.
The administration's short-sighted partisan agenda extends to its unilateral approach to the OECD International Tax Agreement. For the last 2 years, Treasury has used the OECD negotiations to attempt to compel changes in U.S. law without regard for U.S. revenue, for U.S. companies and U.S. workers. Not only has the administration failed to put a stop to digital tax services taxes, But now foreign countries threaten to impose extraterritorial taxes on U.S. companies under the global minimum tax at Treasury's invitation. The latest OEC guidance confirms the administration has agreed to allow foreign countries to collect U.S. guilty revenue and, worse, tax U.S. companies on their U.S. profits in violation of our existing tax treaties. The budget fails to consider these revenue impacts, which, if implemented, will result in billions of dollars of lost U.S. revenue. Meanwhile, the administration continues to hide its true intentions for transforming the IRS. The budget doubles down on the $80 billion already given to the IRS, including 2 more additional years of plus-up funding, totaling $29.1 billion solely for enforcement and compliance initiatives, in addition to $14.1 billion more of yearly funding. That's another $43 billion. Secretary Yellen, I agree with you that having a funding plan for an agency budget that dwarfs many others is critical. In the meantime, the IRS has embarked on a spend first, plan later approach that is not transparent or responsible and is a surefire recipe for error, waste, and mismanagement. While we may not have the details yet, we do know that only 6% of this existing plus-up for funding is for modernization, while over 62% is solely for hiring, more than 93% of that enforcement hiring. These new funds are not going to replace retiring U.S. agents, as annual appropriations already provide that funding. And the administration has not requested any reductions in IRS annual funding to account for replacing retirees with this plussed-up funding. Secretary Yellen, there are opportunities for the administration to work across the aisle on common-sense economic policies, but nothing suggests the president is abandoning the partisan tax and spend policies of the last 2 years. This administration must recommit to working with Republicans to develop real solutions that will stabilize the economy and create higher wages and opportunities for American workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Crapo. Our witness today will be Secretary Janet Yellen. She's the first person to have led the White House Council of Economic Advisors, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department. She's also the first woman to lead the Treasury Department. Before leading Treasury and the Federal Reserve, she was a distinguished fellow in residence at the Brookings Institution. She served as president of the American Economic Association. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the Council on Foreign Relations. She also was a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council. We welcome you, Secretary Yellen, and please proceed.
Thank you. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. I'd like to start with an update on the recent developments in the banking system. This week, the government took decisive and forceful actions to stabilize and strengthen public confidence in our financial system. First, we worked with the Federal Reserve and FDIC to protect all depositors of the 2 failed banks. On Monday morning, customers were able to access all of the money in their deposit accounts so they could make payroll and pay the bills. Shareholders and debt holders are not being protected by the government. Importantly, no taxpayer money is being used or put at risk with this action. Deposit protection is provided by the Deposit Insurance Fund, which is funded by fees on banks. Second, the Federal Reserve is providing additional support to the banking system with a new lending facility. This will help financial institutions meet the needs of all of their depositors. I can reassure the members of the committee that our banking system is sound and that Americans can feel confident that their deposits will be there when they need them. This week's actions demonstrate our resolute commitment to ensure that our financial system remains strong and that depositors' savings remain safe. Now let me turn to the topic of the hearing, the President's fiscal year 2024 budget. Over the past 2 years, the United States has experienced an historic economic recovery. In January 2021, our country was in the middle of an economic calamity triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. But Congress and the President took decisive action through the American Rescue Plan and our vaccination campaign. And today, our unemployment rate is near historic lows, and we've seen the strongest 2 years of business creation in history. Now our task is to navigate our economy's transition from rapid recovery to sustainable growth. This includes bringing down inflation. We have seen some moderation in headline inflation, but more work needs to be done. Our administration will continue to build on the actions we have taken to expand supply and provide cost relief in areas like energy and healthcare. With your partnership, we've also laid a foundation for long-term economic growth. In just the past 2 years alone, Congress passed 3 transformational laws: a generational investment in infrastructure, an historic expansion of American semiconductor manufacturing, and the largest investment in clean energy in our nation's history. A strategic priority for our administration this year is to work with you to effectively implement these laws. We're seeing the early results. In just 7 months, there's been a wave of investments in clean energy manufacturing across the country. And our new resources for the IRS are already paying off. Taxpayers are getting drastically improved customer service this year. For example, we've answered hundreds of thousands more phone calls during this filing season than at this time last year. Our proposed budget builds on our economic progress by making smart, fiscally responsible investments. These investments would be more than fully paid for by requiring corporations and the wealthiest to pay their fair share. Fiscal discipline remains a central priority in our budget. We have proposed a minimum income tax of 25% on taxpayers with wealth in excess of $100 million. We've also proposed an increase of the corporate tax rate to 28% from the current 21%. And it will come as no surprise that I hope Congress will implement the United States' part of the global minimum tax deal. On the spending side, we suggest additional investments to boost our long-term growth potential. This includes improving the availability of high-quality child care, providing free and universal preschool, and boosting the supply of affordable housing. We also propose restoring the child tax credit and earned income tax credit expansions that were enacted in 2021 but have since expired. Importantly, with the proposed tax reforms, we estimate that this budget will deliver deficit reduction of nearly $3 trillion over the next 10 years. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Let me begin with what I emphasized, that it's critically important that Congress takes steps to make sure there's no questions about the full faith and credit of the United States. And this is a matter within the Finance Committee's jurisdiction. Now, on Friday, the House Ways and Means Republicans passed a plan dealing with what they call prioritizing payments by the Treasury. They say that when Treasury runs out of stopgap funding, it should prioritize payments to Wall Street and creditors in China ahead of everybody else. I'm coming off some town hall meetings in Oregon this weekend. Wouldn't be a big hit with everybody. Now, setting aside the merits of this Republican plan, does the federal government have the technical capacity to prioritize some payments ahead of others? I understand there's not even a precedent for this.
The government, on average, makes millions of payments each day, and our systems are built to pay all of our bills on time and not to pick and choose which bills to pay. There is a reason that Treasury secretaries of both parties have rejected this incredibly risky and dangerous idea, and it's never been tried before. I cannot give any assurances about the technical feasibility of such a plan, it would be an exceptionally risky, untested, and radical departure from normal payment practices of agencies across the federal government. And I consider it essential that Congress come together to recognize that raising the debt ceiling is their responsibility to protect the full faith and credit in the United States.
So, you've told us this prioritization scheme is unworkable, and House Republicans don't get to decide what qualifies as a federal default. If the government can meet some but not all of its obligations, isn't that essentially the definition of a default?
Failing to pay your bills is what all of your bills when they're due is what I think of as a default. The United States has always paid all of its bills on time, and it should stay that way, and that's been a core American value since 1789, regardless of party. Presidents and Congresses have always honored all of our commitments, and prioritization is effectively a default by just another name.
I appreciate you bringing us up to date on that, Madam Secretary. And colleagues, the reason I've focused on protecting the full faith and credit of the United States is this is explicitly within this committee's jurisdiction. So I thank you, Secretary Yellen. Let's talk about the double standard in tax enforcement. Too much of the burden falls on working people in the middle class. It's too easy for corporations and the wealthy to get away with cheating every time out. It seems that Republicans are trying hard to keep it that way. They put an amendment to the IRA that, according to the Congressional Budget Office, would have led to even more tax avoidance by the wealthy. It would have encouraged billionaires to disguise their income so they'd appear to the IRS to be typical middle-class wage earners. There have even been Republican efforts to speed up hiring the kind of highly trained and dogged experts that you need to crack down on tax cheating by the wealthy and businesses that have very complicated business structures. And of course, the first bill out of the gate in the House was this $114 billion giveaway to the wealthy tax cheats and the tax dodging corporations. They would have, in effect, repealed the funding Democrats passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. Secretary Yellen, if Republicans had their way and repealed the IRS funding to go after wealthy, tax cheats, what would that do to the agency's ability to really make sure that those people at the very top paid their fair share?
Well, it would allow the wealthy and large corporations to skip out on taxes they legally owe and make life harder for ordinary middle-class families who pay their taxes to get the kind of service that they deserve from the IRS, and it would increase the tax gap and add to the deficit by over $114 billion.
So let's talk about improvements in taxpayer services. Now, the IRS funding, as of early March, the IRS was answering 90% of the calls to its customer service lines and had the backlog of individual returns reduced substantially, in the ballpark of 90%. Now, that's after spending roughly 1% of the IRA funding. Secretary Yellen, if Republicans were able to successfully repeal the Inflation Reduction Act funding, what would that mean for taxpayer services? And the reason I ask that is right now we're in the middle of the filing season. So this isn't some kind of abstract kind of concern. What would it mean for taxpayer services if they repealed the funding?
Well, it just clearly would lead to worse services for taxpayers. Phones would go unanswered, wait times would grow, mail would be processed more slowly, refunds would be delayed. We're undergoing a transition to digital forms, and improved scanning would be delayed. Paper backlogs would grow, and taxpayer assistance centers are now being reopened and fully staffed, and some of them would have to close or be understaffed.
I'm over my time. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me start out, Madam Secretary, with the full faith and credit issue that my colleague Senator Wyden has raised. We are in agreement that we need to protect the full faith and credit of the United States. Frankly, as I indicated in my opening statement, the problem that we see on the Republican side is that it's all tax and all spending increases in terms of the administration's approach to this. And while you and the chairman just discussed a number of concerns you have with Republican ideas with regard to how to deal with this, the bottom line is that we must stop trying to solve this problem by massive new spending and massive new taxes. So we have some disagreements about how to deal with this. What I would ask of you is, at this point, the president has refused to negotiate with Republicans on fiscal restraint policies that they believe need to be put into place with a new extension of the debt ceiling. We must engage in negotiations to get over some of these disagreements, and this new debt ceiling resolution must include fiscal restraint. We've got to get some kind of attention to this. I think the American public is crying out for Congress to pay attention to this issue and put fiscal restraint in place. Can you commit at least to negotiate with Republicans as we try to work forward on finding some aspects of fiscal restraint to put into the debt ceiling discussion?
Senator Crapo, the president has indicated that he considers it critically important to have a sustainable and responsible fiscal path. And he's put on the table in the budget a number of ideas, many ideas about how to grow the economy while also cutting deficits. And this is a matter that he is very prepared to discuss and negotiate with Republicans, but it can't be a condition for raising the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling simply must be raised, and to put at risk the full faith and credit of the United States and to threaten to cause an economic and financial catastrophe isn't an acceptable
Madam Secretary,
requirement.
I interpret your answer to be that you're very willing to discuss the president's budget, tax increases, and increased spending, but you're not willing to discuss, with regard to the debt ceiling discussion, any actual fiscal restraint in terms of spending control in the United States. Now, if I interpreted it wrong, I'm sorry, but we've got to get negotiating on more than just whether the president's budget is the right approach. There are other ideas, and we need to be engaged in it. I just hope that you'll take that message back to the president.
The president has indicated that he would welcome discussions about the stance of fiscal policy.
All right, I appreciate that. Let's move quickly to the SVB crisis in the banking industry. Can we agree, at least as a starter, as we try to understand how this is all playing out, that the issue here in terms of risk is liquidity risk that we are facing in the system, and that SVB had a liquidity risk issue?
Well, there was a run on the bank. It had high reliance on uninsured deposits, and there was a massive withdrawal of deposits that led to liquidity problems. The bank had to be closed for that reason.
So do you agree then that it is a liquidity risk that we're dealing with in this issue?
Well, there was a liquidity risk in this situation. There will be a careful look at what happened in the bank and what initiated this problem, but clearly the downfall of the bank, the reason it had to be closed, was that it couldn't meet depositors' withdrawal requests.
Because their capital was losing value, and they were not able to access their capital, and I attribute that to the interest rate hikes that we are seeing in the face of the inflation. Am I wrong in that?
Well, my understanding is that the bank, to meet liquidity needs, had to sell assets that it expected to hold to maturity. And given the interest rate increases that have occurred since those assets, including treasuries and government-backed mortgage-backed securities, they had lost market value.
All right, yeah, and we're on the same page on that then. I appreciate that. One other question with regard to the bank failure, and this is with regard to the efforts to get a private buyer to help solve this issue. Regarding these issues. The solution would have been to get a private sector solution that protected taxpayers, calmed the markets, and prevented the potential assessments from being inappropriately levied against community banks. Press reports have indicated that some of the FDIC board members may have slow-walked the negotiations with regard to potential political backlash surrounding mergers and acquisitions. And it was because of that that we were not able to move forward promptly with obtaining a buyer. Are those reports accurate?
Well, this is something that is a question for the FDIC, really, rather than me, but I know that the FDIC looked for buyers, and a merger or acquisition is certainly something that they were open to as a way to resolve the institution.
All right, thank you. Very quickly, on the OECD agreement, I'm very much opposed to it, and yet it seems to me that Treasury is pushing for Congress to approve its approach to the OECD negotiations and is already giving support to nations around the world in the OECD to tax U.S. profits that would be directly in contrast or in conflict with U.S. tax treaties. Am I correct in that?
137 countries signed this agreement and see it as a way to put a floor on taxation of corporations and multinational corporations and stop a race to the bottom. And the European Union has adopted Pillar 2, the global minimum tax, and other jurisdictions are moving forward.
My
and
question,
we
my
feel
answer,
it's in the U.S. interest to adopt this. We have proposed.
I understand, Madam Secretary, my time has expired and the chairman's trying to get me to wrap up. I do want to make one more quick statement. I would like to express my concern about numerous proposals in the Green Book in the budget that we won't have time to get into here today. Last year, Treasury did not provide answers to these questions for the record responses for 6 months. And I just would like to ask you to pay attention to this year and have your team respond to us promptly as we get questions for the record on this year's budget.
Senator Grassley.
Yeah. You didn't answer his last question about OECD and tax treaties. Is what you're proposing in any way a violation of the tax treaties that we've had with other countries?
No, there's no violation in anything we've proposed with tax treaties that we've engaged in. This is something that the OECD considered very carefully, and there's no violation of our tax treaty.
Well, we surely don't agree with your analysis of that. Only Congress has the power to approve tax treaties. I want to go to your position as a member of the Social Security Board of Trustees. You and other people put out an annual report, quote, lawmakers should address the projected trust fund shortfalls in a timely way in order to phase in necessary changes gradually and give workers and beneficiaries time to adjust to them, end of quote. I don't disagree at all with that statement. President Biden has claimed that his budget reduces the deficits while protecting Social Security. However, the president's budget includes no proposal to extend the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund. Anyone who knows that things get done around here know it takes presidential leadership to lead major reforms to Social Security. 40 years ago, that was a President Reagan and a Democrat Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, that put together a bipartisan agreement that was overwhelmingly approved by the Congress of the United States, and it has made Social Security sound at least through 2035. So I assume that you stand by your recommendations that lawmakers act sooner rather than later to shore up Social Security trust funds. So can Congress expect to see the president's proposal to put Social Security on a sound fiscal basis along the same ways, replicating the leadership of President Reagan and Tip O'Neill?
President Biden stands ready to work with Congress to shore up Social Security and discuss possible approaches. So that's a conversation that it's important for us to have.
Will come to order. Today's hearing will examine cybersecurity threats facing the healthcare sector, how both the federal government and healthcare providers are working to combat these threats, and what actions Congress should take to bolster our cybersecurity defenses against these attacks. Healthcare is a rapidly growing sector of our economy that employs more than 18 million workers and is made up of both public and private sector organizations related to patient services, medical devices and manufacturers, and electronic health and medical records that store considerable amounts of personal information, making them frequent targets of attack. In recent years, increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks in the healthcare and public health sectors have posed alarming threats to people in Michigan as well as all across our country. Cyber attacks on hospitals and other healthcare providers can cause serious disruptions to their operations and prevent them from effectively providing critical, life-saving care to their patients. Breaches can also lead to the exposure of sensitive, personal, and medical information of patients and healthcare personnel. Most recently, the DC HealthLink, a health insurance marketplace for residents and lawmakers in the nation's capital, experienced a cyber attack that exposed the personal data and information of tens of thousands of people, putting victims at risk of identity theft, scams, and additional cyber attacks. Earlier this year, in my home state, the University of Michigan health system experienced a cyber attack that temporarily limited access to their public websites. Thankfully, in that attack, no patient information was compromised, and the issue was quickly resolved. These relentless cyber attacks show that foreign adversaries and cyber criminals will stop at nothing to exploit cybersecurity vulnerabilities, our critical infrastructure, and most essential systems. What is most concerning about these attacks is that they don't just compromise personal information. They can actually affect patient health and safety. Last month, a ransomware attack on Tallahassee Memorial Healthcare in Florida took the hospital's IT systems offline for more than a week and required them to divert patients to other facilities and cancel procedures until they could restore those networks. In 2019, catastrophic ransomware attack on the Spring Hill Medical Center in Mobile, Alabama, may have even led to a patient's death. The attack prevented healthcare providers from using equipment to monitor a baby's condition during delivery. And as a result, the infant tragically passed away because of delayed medical care. This shocking example just shows how grave the consequences of cyber attacks in the healthcare sector can be. And given the threats facing this sector and the potential life or death consequences, there's no question that investments in healthcare cybersecurity are also investments in patient care. This committee has already taken an important step to strengthen cybersecurity for our critical infrastructure sectors, including the healthcare sector. Last Congress, the committee advanced a bipartisan bill that I introduced along with Senator Portman to require these organizations to report cyber attacks and ransomware payments to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. This law will help ensure that government is able to better track cybersecurity threats to our critical infrastructure, provide more transparency and situational awareness for our cybersecurity defenses, and enable CISA to warn potential victims of ongoing attacks so they know if they could be the next target. This is an important first step, but there's much more for Congress to do to ensure that critical networks in our healthcare and public health sector remain resilient against cyber attacks. I'm grateful our colleague, Senator Rosen, is leading efforts that would improve the way CISA and the Department of Health and Human Services share information about cybersecurity threats with the healthcare sector, as well as provide cybersecurity training to medical professionals. And I look forward to working together to build on these efforts. Today, I'm pleased to have an expert panel of healthcare security professionals who can speak more about the challenges we face and discuss potential solutions. With that, I would normally turn over to a ranking member, which is not here, so I will move to swear in our witnesses. It is the practice of Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses, so if each of you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness is Mr. Scott Dresen. Mr. Dresen serves as the Chief Information Security Officer of Corewell Health. In his role, he is responsible for maintaining and managing the Enterprise Business Assurance Program, including emergency management, business continuity, and operational readiness. Previously, he served as the Chief Information Officer for Wayne State University Physician Group. Mr. Dresen, thank you for being here. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Peters and members of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. It is an honor to be speaking with you about cybersecurity risks. Oh, sorry. It says talk, it's red. Am I okay? All right, my apologies. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for Corewell Health, an integrated health system committed to health and wellness so that people can live their healthiest life possible. Cybersecurity threats to the healthcare sector could compromise our health system's ability to effectively provide access to and deliver healthcare services to our patients and members. Of particular concern are high-impact ransomware attacks, which disrupt and delay healthcare delivery, may cause risk to patient safety, and can be used to conceal activity by threat actors to exfiltrate personal health information. We live in a world where healthcare is highly digital and highly connected, making us vulnerable given the value of the data we manage. We have a responsibility to protect the data of our patients and members, and this obligation is of the highest priority across our system leadership and board of directors. Healthcare is a complex business model whereby multiple, often independent entities come together to form what the patient sees as a cohesive care delivery process. Over time and out of necessity, this model has evolved in ways that has made us more vulnerable to cyber attacks, has expanded the footprint of healthcare systems that must be protected, and increases the opportunities for threat actors to compromise us. Media reports of cyber attacks, data breaches, and unintended exposure of sensitive data underscores the vulnerability of healthcare systems to these disruptive incidents and the impact to our patients and members. Operational disruption prevents patients from being able to receive the care they need when they need it. Material financial impact in the form of fines, penalties, and associated remediation costs increase financial pressures significantly. Brand and reputational impacts can have lasting consequences on organizations victimized by cyber attacks. These issues only serve to undermine the trust our communities have in our healthcare system and our ability to serve them in their most vulnerable time of need. A comprehensive information security program is critical to manage these risks. Yet there exists significant disparity in the healthcare sector for organizations to resource an effective security team and the necessary technology to provide the requisite protections to reduce the risk of an attack. Small and medium-sized healthcare systems are at a significant disadvantage compared to larger systems to be able to recruit, retain, and fund an effective information security program. And despite the advantage larger organizations have in comparison, the increasing trend of attacks prove even the largest organizations are vulnerable and can be compromised. The increasing frequency of attack from nation-state actors and organized crime has created a sense of urgency within the healthcare sector, and we need help from the United States government to respond to these threats more effectively. Requirements for interagency sharing of cybersecurity threat intelligence is a productive step forward. We need more of this and need that enhanced collaboration to include critical infrastructure sector participation, including the ability to automate threat intelligence data sharing with sector participants, enabling rapid, near real-time automatic ingestion of threat intelligence into the technologies participating members use to protect their respective organizations. The United States government has actionable intelligence that would be of immediate value to the healthcare sector. While there is some degree of automated intelligence sharing, we need to make more of that intelligence accessible. We are in an environment where keeping up with technology to defend against advanced persistent threat is extremely expensive. Many of these technologies are an option for financially disadvantaged healthcare systems due to cost. We recommend creating incentives to make technology more affordable and accessible to the entire healthcare sector. We recommend reforms on the penalties healthcare entities face because of cyber attacks and related data breaches. We understand and support the legislative intent to encourage adoption of best practices and the implementation of appropriate protections to safeguard our data. However, penalizing victims of cyber attack when defensive measures can't keep up with the sophistication of hackers is not the fair approach. We are at our best and most capable when it comes to caring for our patients and members. That is our expertise. Our adversaries are at their best and most capable when they are attacking us. They are extremely well-funded, extremely talented, and highly motivated. Many are either nation-state actors or sponsored and supported by nation-states. We can't beat them alone, but together we can be more effectively protecting this vital, critical infrastructure sector. Thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dresen, for your testimony. Our next witness is Ms. Kate Pierce. Ms. Pierce serves as the Senior Virtual Information Security Officer at Fortified Health Security. Ms. Pierce has over 2 decades of experience at North Country Hospital, where she served as the Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer. Ms. Pierce is also part of the Fortified Health Security, one of the leading healthcare-only cybersecurity managed services companies in the United States. Ms. Pierce, welcome to our committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Chairman Peters and members of the committee, my name is Kate Pierce. I served as the CIO and CISO for a critical access hospital in Vermont for over 21 years, and I currently serve as the Virtual Information Security Officer for Fortified Health Security. I thank you for this opportunity to address the committee to provide an industry perspective on cybersecurity threats, specifically in the small and rural facilities. In 2022, healthcare continued to be the most targeted critical infrastructure sector, with nearly a quarter of ransomware attacks directed at healthcare. We also saw cyber criminals shift their focus to small and rural hospitals, with this group lagging behind in strengthening their defenses. Average recovery times expanded and costs for healthcare attacks increased to over $10.1 million per incident. Our rural hospitals are facing unprecedented budget constraints, with up to 30% or more in the red. With the public health emergency scheduled to end in May, many hospitals anticipate a rise in free care, with as many as 15 million Medicaid patients projected to lose coverage. Cyber programs continue to lag behind, with budgeted security spending directed to cover higher priority expenses. These small hospitals struggle to employ and retain skilled cybersecurity professionals, and often with little to no staff solely dedicated to security. Cyber insurance coverage can no longer be considered an alternative, with skyrocketing premiums, lower limits, and increasing requirements. The value of healthcare records in the dark web continues to be more than 60 times higher than other records. The risk of identity theft, credit card fraud, and reputational harm is now supplemented by patients being directly exploited with threats to release their sensitive information on the web. Post-attack, hospitals are now seeing a rise in civil cases costing millions of dollars. The impact on our rural communities during an attack is hard to overstate. While attacks in urban areas are impactful, populated areas provide other healthcare options for patients to choose. In most rural areas, the nearest healthcare facility may be 45 miles or more away, making the diversion of patients unfeasible. With direct attacks causing outages lasting weeks and sometimes months, the impact on patient safety is easy to comprehend. Delays in care can directly contribute to negative outcomes for many high-risk conditions. Facilities that continue to treat patients are challenged to provide high levels of patient care without access to patient information, safety alerts, delays in results, and other key tools. To meet these challenges, I recommend implementing several measures to improve the cybersecurity for our small and rural facilities. First, we must move beyond guidance and recommendations and create minimum standards for cybersecurity. These standards must be reasonable, achievable, and continually evolving as cybersecurity requirements change. Specific recommendations are in my written testimony. Second, we cannot leave our small and rural hospitals behind. Funding opportunities must be made available to these hospitals. My insights on subsidies, grants, and other initiatives are also included in my written testimony. Third, we need better coordination of government cyber efforts. While guidance and services for many agencies is appreciated, there's often a knowledge gap regarding the unique healthcare challenges that must be considered. Also, most rural hospitals are not effectively utilizing available resources. To be effective, government services must be streamlined, knowledgeable, and available. Last, establishing a FEMA cyber disaster relief program would provide this vulnerable sector with important resources. This could assist organizations in their recovery process and increase the likelihood that hospitals can survive beyond an attack. In conclusion, small and rural healthcare organizations are losing the cybersecurity battle. The Cybersecurity Act of 2015 is now 8 years old. While advancements have been made with respect to published documents, services, and guidance, as a nation, definitive, coordinated action is needed now. Our rural hospitals are in crisis, and further delay would jeopardize healthcare for our rural communities. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Pierce. Thank you for your testimony. Our next witness is Mr. Greg Garcia. Mr. Garcia serves as the Executive Director for Cybersecurity of the Healthcare and Public Health Sector Coordinating Council. It's a convening organization that works in partnership with other federal agencies to protect the security and resilience of these sectors. Mr. Garcia served as the nation's first Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications under President George W. Bush. Previously, Mr. Garcia held executive positions with the Bank of America and served as professional staff on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in the U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome to the committee, sir. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Peters and members of the committee. Thanks for inviting me to testify today. I am the Executive Director of the Health Sector Coordinating Council. We are an industry-led advisory council of more than 350 healthcare organizations and government agencies working together as a public-private partnership. The main point I want to leave you with today is that the industry is mobilizing collaboratively against evolving cyber threats in the health system, and our government is doing the same and can be doing more. The industry is regulated for cybersecurity in various ways, and more is being contemplated. But there are ways that HHS, that CISA, and other government offices can improve coordination in programs and funding to facilitate the security of the health sector. What matters most about cyber insecurity in the health sector is the potential impact on patient safety. We've heard that from our previous witnesses. In particular, ransomware events over the past few years have resulted in clinical disruptions that can cause and have caused harm to patients. Consider when a health system is disabled by a cyber incident. Stroke, trauma, cardiac, imaging, and other systems and services are closed to admission. Ambulances with patients en route to hospitals are diverted. Radiation and surgery for cancer patients are delayed. Medical records for prescriptions, diagnoses, therapies are inaccessible or lost. Clinical trial data are lost. Payment systems are down. Ordering and receiving supplies is disrupted. And what we see now and in the future is a changing healthcare system that may complicate this challenge. Consider that healthcare innovation is going direct to the consumer, to wearable and home medical technology and telemedicine. This expands the so-called attack surface for connected technology outside the clinical environment, which is harder for hospitals to secure remotely with patients. There's an increase in mergers and acquisitions among provider institutions, and that involves having to integrate incompatible systems, different suppliers. That adds to complexity, cost, and risk. There's an increased migration to cloud service providers, in which technology, clinical data management systems, and software are outsourced to third parties. And that can increase the scalability of attack to thousands of customers with just one mouse click. There are workforce shortages that Ms. Pierce referred to in both clinical and cybersecurity support, which strains the ability to manage those intersecting needs, cyber and clinical. And finally, the cyber insurance market. It's simultaneously retrenching, increasing premiums, reducing coverage, and this is severely limiting its risk reduction value. So what are we doing about it? How do individual enterprises deal with these threats, and how does the sector collectively deal with it? I'm going to concentrate my answer on the latter question. As I mentioned earlier, the Health Sector Council is one of many federally designated critical infrastructure sector coordinating councils. Healthcare is in the same category as financial services, telecommunications, electricity, and others. And we are organized to work with our government counterparts to identify and mitigate threats and incidents from pandemics, natural disasters, supply chain disruptions, and cyber attack. In government, there are designated sector risk management agencies, or the SRMA, in our case, HHS. They're directed by statute and executive orders to work with their corresponding critical sectors on this shared mission. Not just with regulation, but with partnership and innovative problem solving. Indeed, cyber regulation on the nation's small and under-resourced health systems cannot succeed without corresponding support from the government. So to reduce that cyber and patient risk, our council over the past 5 years has worked tirelessly. We started with fewer than 50 members in 2017, and now the council has grown to 380 industry organizations and 16 government organizations. We're all motivated by the same unifying imperative that patient safety requires cyber safety. We are structured into task groups that work on specific cybersecurity problems. The result over the past 4 years is the publication of 18 cybersecurity best practices and guidance documents by the sector for the sector. Medical device security, cybersecurity for health systems, workforce development, information sharing, intellectual property protection, etc. 2 of these resources were published jointly by our council and by HHS. This demonstrates the importance we place on this shared responsibility, and 4 more resources are in the pipeline for publication in the second quarter of this year, one of which is another joint publication with HHS. But as a partnership with government, we are making positive steps, but we can do more. We're encouraged that HHS is reorganizing to enhance its SRMA responsibilities. That means working with us in industry to develop cybersecurity initiatives, incentives, and programs. It means improving information sharing, impact analysis, and incident response. And it means coordinating across the agency and with industry to make cybersecurity policy development and enforcement more matrixed and coherent. Some of that may require congressional action. And it's commendable that CISA, in its role as the National Coordinator for Critical Infrastructure Protection, has directed more of its attention to healthcare cybersecurity. But that level of attention needs to be triangulated among HHS as the sector lead, CISA as the technical support, and industry as the owners and operators. In our view, that necessary relationship is improving, and we're glad for that, but more improvement can be done. In conclusion, my written statement includes options we are considering as recommendations for how the government can better partner with that critical infrastructure sector against evolving threats, and I'll be happy to discuss them during the question period. To finalize, we are working collectively in pursuit of the imperative that patient safety requires cyber safety, and succeeding at this will mean, as my friend and former National Cyber Director Chris Inglis would tell us, to beat one of us, you have to beat all of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia, for your testimony. Our final witness is Mr. Stirling Martin. Mr. Martin is the Senior Vice President for Epic. In his over 25 years at Epic, he has helped develop, implement, and support Epic's products and work closely with customers around the world to ensure their needs are met. Mr. Martin also serves as the Chief Security and Privacy Officer and President of Epic's hosting business. Mr. Martin, thank you for being here today. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you. Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide my testimony today. My name is Stirling. My formal training is as a computer scientist, and I'm the Chief Security and Privacy Officer and Senior Vice President for EPIC. Since 1979, we have created clinical, financial, and administrative systems, including the patient portal MyChart, for healthcare organizations in the United States and around the world. Our customers include academic medical centers, large integrated health systems, small critical access hospitals, and federally qualified health centers. Our focus first and foremost is on helping patients. Personal health data is uniquely sensitive if compromised because it cannot be reset like passwords or changed like credit card information. A patient's health information can also be immensely personal, and even just the threat of exposure can create angst for an individual. If exposed, private healthcare data can be leveraged by malicious actors through identity theft and the potential for blackmail. In an extreme case, patient safety could be directly impacted if a bad actor were to manipulate healthcare data. Within a community, cyber attacks can reduce access to care. In a rural community with only one healthcare facility, patients may need to delay preventative care or elective treatments until an incident is resolved. In a larger community, cyber attacks can have a cascading effect, as patients may be diverted to an unfamiliar care team at another facility. And those facilities need to deal with an influx of additional patients. We've been shoulder to shoulder with our customers as healthcare has become increasingly targeted by cyber attacks. For a health system, a cyber attack disrupts their patient care mission and causes both reputational harm and financial burden. Organizations often take their systems offline as they mitigate the impact of a security incident. Doing so places stress on staff to provide high-quality care without the IT systems that drive their workflows. As organizations may see fewer patients, the financial impact extends beyond the cost of incident response to lost revenue as well. Organizations face several challenges in improving their security posture. First is staffing and their ability to hire and retain high-demand security talent. Second, security is a constant effort, and there are always more steps that can be taken to make systems more secure. In working with health organizations across the country, we see both basic and highly sophisticated security programs in use. And yet, there is no defined benchmark for what security practices are considered sufficient. An additional challenge is the lack of cybersecurity information sharing among healthcare organizations, as well as limited threat intelligence from government agencies and private industry. These challenges are exacerbated as many health organizations currently face unprecedented financial and staffing pressures. The cost to improve one's security posture through new technology or staff must be weighed against other needs, such as hiring or retaining nurses at the bedside. There are a variety of ways the federal government could help health organizations prevent and respond to cyber attacks. Starting first with prevention. There is a dire shortage of security talent in the United States. To build a deeper bench of skilled IT security professionals, the federal government could develop security training programs and incentivize newly trained professionals working in healthcare. This could be similar to the Rural Community Loan Repayment Program for physicians who agree to provide care in rural communities after medical school and residency. Secondly, the industry needs a single set of prescriptive security practices, whether defined by federal agencies such as NIST or CISA, industry efforts such as HITRUST, or a collaboration such as the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. This will raise the overall security posture of healthcare organizations by encouraging them to meet those acceptable security practices. The government should take the further step of establishing a legal safe harbor for organizations that meet the defined benchmark if they fall victim to a security incident. This would encourage information sharing to remediate active issues more quickly and prevent similar issues in the future, and could be further bolstered by government agencies sharing deeper threat intelligence. Lastly, on incident response, similar to how FEMA responds to a natural disaster, at-the-elbow support from the government could help healthcare organizations remediate an attack. For example, an organization recovering from a ransomware attack may need assistance cleaning and redeploying computers used by their staff. On-the-ground support could help reduce the time it takes to bring systems back online by patching devices or by delivering a strategic reserve of computers and network equipment that could be used immediately. This could reduce the recovery time by hours or even days, providing tremendous value to healthcare organizations and the patients they serve. In closing, people often ask me what keeps me up at night. And it's the fact that we have to be perfect 100% of the time. And the bad guys, they only have to get lucky once. Thank you for the opportunity to share EPIC's perspective on this important topic.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you for your opening comments. My first question is for Mr. Dresen. Clearly, we know cyber attacks are pervasive all through our society and all across our economy now, and they're increasing in intensity. But my question for you is, what do you see as a distinguishing characteristic of working to secure the healthcare sector from cybersecurity attacks? When we look at it in total, what's the distinguishing factor with healthcare?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I appreciate the opportunity to answer. For me, the defining characteristic of the work that we do really comes down to the clarity of focus we have around the impact of the decisions we make, the actions we take, and the things we're doing to help protect our organization, understanding that when a cyber attack does occur and has the potential for significant operational disruption, financial penalties, long-standing reputational impact to the organization, it ultimately affects our families, it affects our neighbors, it affects our community. And so there's a clear connection to purpose for the work that we do, understanding that the impact if things don't go well can be significant on the people who are closest to us. So for me, that's the defining characteristic of what it means to protect the healthcare sector from cyber attack.
Thank you. My next question is for you, Ms. Pierce. Certainly all hospitals across the country are still dealing with the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. But rural hospitals in particular are really challenged. They are often bound to provide care to a high concentration of patients with limited financial resources. As you mentioned, these hospitals are often located many miles apart. They're very far from urban centers, which present a number of other challenges for them. So my question for you, ma'am, is how can the federal government help ensure that small and rural hospitals are able to invest in cybersecurity while also balancing all the needed investments that they have to make to provide quality patient care?
Thank you for that question, Senator Peters. Senator Warner stated it well when he said that cybersecurity is patient safety. Cybersecurity initiatives cannot be considered in isolation. They have direct and immediate impact on patient care. And small and rural facilities are currently devastated still by the pandemic. With staffing shortages, they have seen significant increased cost with supply chain and technical costs skyrocketing. Rural facilities also tend to serve lower income patients, they've showed that the longer that you have to travel is a direct correlation to the income levels for the patients. This means that our Medicaid population is typically higher in these rural facilities. This Medicaid reimbursement tends to lag behind and is lower than the average cost of care for these rural facilities. Even Medicare reimbursements for CAHs for critical access hospitals tend to lag 2 to 3 years behind as cost reports for those facilities take time to reconcile. So we are experiencing these high costs, but it's taking a long time for the reimbursement levels to catch up, which is creating a crisis in budgets. I've seen small hospitals running 5 to 10% below budget for their facilities, and we cannot continue at that rate. While I agree it's important to control costs, cybersecurity should be a built-in requirement for all hospitals with minimum standards that are required. Medicaid should also reimburse at cost. This can be the subsidies for hospitals could be in the form of grants. It could be in the form of CMS increased reimbursement for services or incentive programs similar to meaningful use, sort of a meaningful security type incentive program. I urge you, however, to not delay any longer. Many are already on the brink of closure. Thank you.
Hey, Ms. Pierce. Mr. Garcia, in your experience, how does the Sector Coordinating Council, along with the federal government, working right now to address some of these significant challenges faced by our small and rural hospitals?
We have a number of engagements with our government partners on a regular basis. Every other Friday, in fact, we meet with our HHS and CISA counterparts to think about longer-term strategic direction. In fact, we are beginning the process now of developing a 5-year strategic plan, looking at how is the healthcare industry changing over the next 5 years? What cybersecurity challenges do those changes introduce, and how do we prepare for them? I will say one of the flagship resources that we produced that is scalable from small rural critical access hospitals all the way up to the large national and regional systems is something called HICCUP, the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices. This is actually the result, initially as the result of an act of Congress. And it comes out of something called the 405D program. 405D, Section 405D of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. It directed HHS to work with industry to develop a series of cybersecurity best practices for health systems. That process took about 1.5 years to develop these best practices, which is a joint effort between HHS, which owns the 405D program, and the Health Sector Coordinating Council. So this is partnership at its best, where there is consensus about what health systems need to do in cybersecurity, some of the basic blocking and tackling. Not necessarily expensive and a high investment level, but some of the foundational elements of good cybersecurity practices. So that is just one example. And on our website, healthsectorcouncil.org, there are 18 resources, best practices that are accessible to any stakeholders who need them, all the way from medical device security best practices to workforce development, to intellectual property protection, supply chain security, which is a huge issue for all of us. So I would commend the public to those resources.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Senator Hessen, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses, not only for being before the committee today, but for the work you do to protect patient privacy and safety. We really appreciate it. Ms. Pierce, I want to start with a couple of questions for you that really follow up on what Senator Peters was asking about with a focus on rural hospitals. I am really concerned as someone from a small state, your next door neighbor, New Hampshire, about cybersecurity threats to rural or smaller healthcare providers. In 2021, a ransomware attack targeted a small health service in Berlin, New Hampshire, forcing the provider to shut down some of its clinics for several days. Based on your experience as a cybersecurity professional, what are the most significant cybersecurity challenges facing rural and smaller healthcare providers?
I think thank you for that question, Senator. I believe that some of the biggest issues that these organizations faced is the fact that nearly all the staff in a critical access hospital or a small facility wear many hats. They don't specifically focus on cybersecurity, and with the competing priorities that we're now seeing in healthcare, it's very difficult to focus on something that is not required. If I had 10 things to do today, and I knew that 2 of them were mandated and required for me to do, those are the things that I'll focus on. So as we continue to provide guidance and recommendation from the federal government, we haven't seen any minimum standards or requirements from the government, which would take us to the point where those would become imperative for facilities to implement. So I would urge us to go in that direction, but don't do that without supporting us in achieving those standards.
Right, because one of the differences I think you're really referencing is a larger, more metropolitan hospital might have the capacity to have an administrative staff where somebody with the expertise and focus can really devote themselves to cyber. And in our smaller places, even when they're fully staffed on the patient care side, the administrative staffing tends to be very, very sparse.
I agree.
There are a number of resources and tools available for healthcare entities to improve their cybersecurity, such as the best practice guidance that Mr. Garcia described today in his testimony. But as we've just discussed, rural hospitals are under-resourced, understaffed. You got at this a little bit with Senator Peters. Ms. Pierce, you were talking about the need to make sure funding is really reimbursing costs, but what specifically can the federal government do to ensure that small and rural healthcare providers are both aware of and have the ability to utilize existing resources and tools for cybersecurity?
I think the first step that we need to take is to move from guidance and recommendations to minimum standards. Once we do that, I believe that those recommendations and guidance will be very helpful in moving that sector to secure their environments. Currently, I've worked with a lot of small hospitals, being with Fortified, hospitals across the country, and invariably they are at a state where there is absolutely no security program to it's very minimal. We asked all of our healthcare organizations to perform risk assessments when we implemented the HITECH Act. So everyone is now aware of where their risks are, but they're choosing to accept those risks in lieu for mostly for financial reasons where they can't afford or can't staff their personnel to address those risks.
So your thinking is that some baseline standards and requirements would kind of drive hospitals to work with the federal government and others to find out the resources they need and then to actually prioritize that. That fair?
That's fair. Also, don't forget, we need to also provide them the ability to actually implement their security measures.
Fair enough. Okay. A question for you, Mr. Garcia. The Health Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the Health ISAC, is a valuable forum where healthcare partners can share vital cybersecurity information, such as intelligence about current and future threats or best practices for addressing those threats. However, as we just heard, smaller healthcare entities are already under-resourced and understaffed. In your experience, do rural and smaller healthcare entities have adequate access to the Health ISAC?
The Health ISAC does provide a lot of free resources to the public at large. I think, as Ms. Pierce expressed, however, there's a lot of information out there, and trying to sift through it in ways that would be relevant and actionable to your particular instance is difficult. Many hospital systems around the country rely also on regional clusters, information sharing and analysis organizations, peer organizations within a region where there's a trust relationship. So there's a lot of options for how you gather your information. At this point, the Health ISAC is populated by a lot of very well-resourced organizations that do have sophisticated information security professionals who are really tracking this on a 24/7 basis. So the priority is for every organization to consider what kind of information are you able to actually take in and then take action on.
So are there incentives that we could use to help smaller rural hospitals really access the Health ISAC, or are there barriers that they have to membership in it right now? How can we help them become more integrated into the Health ISAC?
Well, my feeling is it is a small investment. It's an investment into collective defense, but absolutely. I mean, I think that some kind of subsidies or financial support for smaller systems to get involved either in the Health ISAC or other information sharing organizations, if it's a cost matching subsidy that would help them into this kind of a community, I think would be tremendously beneficial. Small hospitals have to make all kinds of existential financial decisions about resource prioritization. So to help them get into a collective organization where you have this communal situational awareness, I think is a good first step. You can't protect against what you don't see.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hess. And Senator Carper, you're recognized for your questions.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for pulling us all together. Important subjects. And to our panel, thank you for joining us as well. I have my first question. I'm going to ask each of you to respond to. My second question, if I have time, Mr. Garcia, it'll come to you. So, question for all of you. Let's just start with Mr. Martin. When it deals with cyber best practices and preventive measures. But when I think about healthcare, I focus on a few key points. One of those is access to healthcare, making sure Americans broadly have access to healthcare, affordable healthcare, hopefully. I focus on the quality of the healthcare that's provided. And I focus a lot on prevention, not just dealing with the symptoms of problems, but also working on prevention. I also think about a right to privacy and empowering people to do things to help keep themselves healthy. And when it comes to cybersecurity, I believe these same issues apply, which leads me to two questions that I want to ask each of you to take a moment to respond to. And the first of those questions is, how can the federal government improve access to information on cyber best practices for the healthcare industry? That would be the first question. And the second is, how can we make sure that that healthcare systems are doing their part to take preventative measures to protect their own networks? And Mr. Martin, would you lead us off, please?
Senator, thank you for your questions. In terms of providing access to best practices, there is no shortage of recommendations and guidance and things that organizations could be or should be doing. As I sort of look across the broader industry, the challenge we see is taking stock of all of those different resources and deciding what to actually do, given all those different inputs. And as I talked about in my opening statement, I think one of the key things that the federal government can do to help would be to establish a minimum threshold for security best practices. And that threshold can and should continue to change through time. We need to continue to raise all boats here by continuing to advance the state of security in the industry. But having that minimum threshold would be incredibly helpful for organizations, which then gets to your second question of what can the organizations do. Today, they're trying to balance lots of different competing priorities, whether you're a large organization or a small organization, as Ms. Pierce talked about. Trying to balance all of those different competing priorities is incredibly challenging. And having that minimum target to shoot for will help make sure everyone is marching towards that target and ultimately raise the security posture of everyone in the community.
All right. Same two questions for the other, and we'll go with Mr. Garcia to you. How can the federal government improve access to information on cyber best practice for the healthcare industry? That's number one. Number two, how can we make sure that the healthcare systems are doing their part to take preventive measures to protect their own networks? Go right ahead.
Yes, sir. Thanks for the question, Senator. Within the Department of Health and Human Services is an office called HC3, the Healthcare Cyber Coordination Center, which is a knowledge center, which is growing, and we would like to see that grow more. It is the center that collects information about cyber threats, vulnerabilities, incidents, provides analysis, and then in turn pushes it back out to the health sector. They have regular monthly briefings talking about various threats and what to do to mitigate against those threats. That's a very helpful resource. And on top of that, I mentioned earlier the Section 405D task group that has produced the health industry cyber practices. That update is coming out in just a few weeks. It's going to be called HICCUP 2023. This is a set of best practices, just as Mr. Martin was referring to, that are minimum security practices that all health systems should be implementing. And those are developed by the sector, for the sector, and jointly with HHS. So that there is, as Ms. Pierce said, a glut of information security best practices out there. We need to pick one, because there is a lot of confusion. So, we advocate that the health industry cyber practices is probably the best effort at a joint government industry publication offered freely accessible to all health systems. And then CISA needs to follow and push that along with us. Okay. That's number one. Question number two is how can health systems do their part? We've talked about that a lot, and we need to do a culture change. That it's been a cultural problem for as long as I've been in cybersecurity, that everyone outside of the security team says, cybersecurity, that's the security team's job, not my job. I'm the CIO, I'm the CISO, or rather the CEO, I'm in administration. No, it's actually everybody's job, right down to the clinician. Indeed, one of the biggest threats in cybersecurity generally is the frontline user. Anybody who is touching a keyboard or a tablet or a phone or any kind of medical technology.
I'm going to ask you to hold it right there.
Yep.
I want to give these folks an
Certainly.
opportunity. Thanks for those responses, though. Ms. Pierce?
I agree with Mr. Garcia and Mr. Martin. There are a number of best practices available. As Mr. Garcia said, they've published many documents on cybersecurity. So I don't think that there's a lack of information. What I think is happening especially for small and rurals, is that there's a lack of attention to that information. It's not a priority currently because there are so many other things that are competing with it. There's no one taking those best practices off the shelf and actually putting them in practice within those organizations, because it's currently a recommendation or a guidance. It's not a requirement. Okay. So I'd say the best thing we can do is set some minimum requirements and then begin to embed them into everything that we do in healthcare. It's, even with the 21st Century Cures Act, there were mandates on interoperability. There's been a big expansion of devices and technologies that have been implemented, but cybersecurity is always a second thought.
Okay, hold it right there, Mr. Dresen. I'm running out of time. Just very briefly, if you can, both questions, please.
Thank you, Senator. Very briefly, to complement what my panelists have already stated, I think the other aspect of making best practice information available is ensuring that we have adequate staff to execute and implement those best practices. And so advocacy and sponsorship of programming to help build a cyber-educated workforce so that we have qualified individuals who can participate in our organizations to implement those best practices would be extremely useful. And in the context of the healthcare sector's ability to do that is to hire those people and get them implementing those best practices to support our protections.
Great. Mr. Chairman, I'll ask for the record a question dealing with communications between CISA, HHS, and health sector. But if we receive that question for the record, please respond. That's all I'd ask. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I need to leave briefly to be at an Armed Services Committee hearing, so Senator Padillo will take the gavel. But before I leave, I'll recognize Senator Hawley for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for all the witnesses, or to all of the witnesses for being here. This is a topic that is very important to us in the state of Missouri, where we have not only many hospitals, of course, but many rural hospitals. And there have been a number of major cyber attacks against hospitals in the state of Missouri. In September of 2021, for example, a ransomware group stole confidential patient information, which included names, social security numbers, and medical information from a health center in Sikeston, Missouri, which is in the southeast part of our state. In March of last year, it was reported that a hospital affiliated with the University of Missouri Health System experienced a cyber attack in which a third party gained data, sensitive patient data. And just a few months ago, a hospital based in Marshall, Missouri, found out that more than 112,000 individuals were affected by a data breach. So obviously, this is a very significant problem. And I'm also concerned about the interplay of foreign adversaries here like China, and I want to get to that in just a second. But Ms. Pierce, if I could just start with you and focusing in particular on rural hospitals. In Missouri, we have 67 hospitals classified as rural hospitals, including one in the town where I grew up. That's about 40%. of the hospitals in my state. So we are a rural state, and proudly so, but I'm obviously very concerned about the threat that cyber attacks pose for rural hospitals in particular. And I wonder if, just building on the statements you made to Senator Hassan, can you give us a sense, what are the one or two most important steps that you think rural hospitals and rural healthcare facilities can take to shore up their cyber defenses?
Thank you for that question. I've had the pleasure of working with some hospitals from your state, and I can assure you that it's not for lack of wanting to address these issues. Part of the issue that I'm seeing across the board from not just Missouri, but from other states, is just a lack of funding, a lack of ability to be able to address the issues that they know about. Some of the things that they could do, I had included in my written statement, but top priorities would be they need to obviously have strong passwords. We've done a poor job at implementing strong passwords, and that's one of the areas where attackers are able to breach our networks. Another aspect that is important is being able to monitor our networks 24/7. Most small facilities have no staff to be able to monitor. So even if they have the tools for log management or for monitoring the endpoint devices, if nobody's watching the console and nobody's there to pick that up, then it could be hours, critical hours in a cyber attack before they even notice that somebody has gotten into their network.
Let me ask you about the urban-rural divide. How do you assess the current state of cybersecurity in rural hospitals versus urban? And what, if there is a disparity, as I imagine there is, to what do you attribute that? Is it funding? What are the factors there?
I would say from my experience, urban hospitals predominantly have staff within their facility. Some of them multiple staff that are addressing each area of the complex issue of cybersecurity. Smaller facilities, from my experience, they have seen most of them have no staff that are directly assigned to cyber, or they have very little staff in that area. So I think there's a huge disparity between them. What we need to know is that most small hospitals are connected to larger tertiary care centers. We need a place to refer our sicker patients. So this is the path of least resistance for our cyber attackers. When they're trying to figure out how to get to those big systems, they're coming in through our small hospitals. And we've seen that play out in 2022, where small hospital is the avenue of least resistance. The cyber attackers attack there where they know the defenses are low and actually gain access to a plethora of information.
So is part of what needs to happen here these rural hospitals that are, as you say, are often part of larger hospital networks? I mean, do the larger at the network level, do we need to have more staff there that can perform the monitoring? Because I'm just thinking about the hospital in the town where I grew up, and it was very important. My little town was the county seat, it was the county hospital, but they didn't have excess staff. Not that it's excess to cybersecurity, but they didn't have a lot of staff. Let's put it that way. What staff they did have were treating patients. So which is exactly the scenario you described. So I'm trying to think about when we try to find a solution for these rural hospitals, we say you need to have staff that are devoted to cybersecurity. They're going to say, how in the world would we do that? So do we need the larger hospital networks who at the administrative level probably do have staff? Should they be the ones who are taking on this burden? I mean, what's the path forward here, do you think?
I think that we did allow, through the Stark Law changes, for larger facilities to assist smaller facilities with their cyber defense, and I think we saw absolutely no traction in that area. They were given some leeway to do that, and they have not extended those opportunities to small facilities. I believe that the answer would be to incentivize these facilities to secure their own networks, to ensure that they have access to some funds that will enable them to implement the security that they need to protect their networks.
Very good. Thank you for that. Mr. Dresen, if I could just There you are. If I could just switch to you for a second, I want to talk about China. You write in the testimony you submitted about the increasing frequency of attacks from nation-state actors and organized crime. Just drilling in on China for a second, do you have any sense of the number and percentage of the attacks that we've seen recently, these cyber attacks that are committed by Chinese hackers?
I don't have specific details of the types of the sorts of attack from China versus Russia versus other countries. It's just significant in terms of the daily barrage we get and are repelling to help protect us.
What could the government do, the U.S. government be doing to help protect hospitals and healthcare systems from attacks by these nation-state actors? And, you know, particularly, again, given China, where we're seeing we've heard testimony in this committee before about the huge increase in cyber attacks across industries, but arguably none more important than the healthcare industry. What could the U.S. government be doing to help counter that?
Well, we need to take a whole team approach to solve this problem, where the hospitals and healthcare sector are the defensive side of that equation and that relationship, where we're defending our organizations, and then having the federal government bringing higher levels of risk and consequences to those who are attacking us. I think the recent example of the Hive being taken down is a great one to celebrate a reduction of risk to our organizations, and so getting more aggressive like that to help protect the organizations, and then again helping to provide more actionable intelligence to the health sector in a real-time manner to allow us to be as able as possible to protect ourselves with the most current threat information that the government has access to.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Blumenthal is next.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Let me pursue that question. Wouldn't it be important for our law enforcement and intelligence agencies to take more proactive and maybe more aggressive action with respect to China and Russia if they are condoning or even encouraging ransomware attacks?
We would certainly promote and advocate for increased collaboration between government agencies, especially those who have threat intelligence and awareness of those types of activities.
More than just collaboration, shouldn't there be greater focus on
there
it?
should
more
be
resources devoted to it and more prosecution. Obviously, prosecution may be difficult because the actors may be beyond our jurisdictional reach, but certainly there are sanctions that can be imposed.
Opportunities for attribution are challenging in these types of circumstances, and so when that's possible, I would certainly support it. And the actionable threat intelligence that these entities can share with us to help us better protect ourselves defensively would be extremely helpful.
Do you think there's actionable intelligence that right now is unshared?
I think there probably is in the context of active investigations that may be taking place, and so, you know, the opportunity to share that with our sector as much as they can would be encouraged.
Do you know of specific investigations that have not been shared?
I do not.
Do you hear from colleagues in the industry about such investigation?
Not typically, no.
Why do you say there are?
I think there's a perception that from law enforcement, when they tell us that they may have investigations, they can't share information with us. They don't give us specifics. They just make us aware that there are active investigations. And then we see through press reports when they do release information, like the Hive getting taken down. You understand that was a very long process that it took them to take that action. And so you understand that those types of activities take time to work themselves through.
But if there were more effective prosecution, either by the Department of Justice or by other agencies, it would have some deterrent effect.
I think any improvement in our ability to defend ourselves from those threats would be helpful.
Do any of the other members of the panel have responses on this issue?
You know, I would say that there are innovative ways to deal with this before there's an opportunity for prosecution. That is various forms of takedown. I was with the financial services sector some time before this, and we'd worked closely with the Justice Department to identify criminal groups that were waging botnet battles, that is, hundreds of thousands or millions of computers infecting major systems. And we worked with the Justice Department using available statutory authorities such as RICO, Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, to simply take down the network that was operating the botnet. So it's a proactive way of dealing with it. Other actions are clearly classified in the intelligence community that in private sector does not participate in. But there's a lot of information that cannot be shared with industry because it's been classified or it is under investigation, as Mr. Dresen
Should more of it be unclassified to help industry safeguard itself?
I think there's general consensus that there's a problem of overclassification in the government. Too much information is being classified unnecessarily, and indeed information that sometimes flows from the private sector to the government is subsequently classified.
In other words, information comes from open public sources, it's provided to an agency of government, and then it's classified.
Because there may be additional intelligence attached to that that adds nuance or context.
Would you like to see more effective investigation, more takedowns, more prosecution by the Department of Justice or other
Certainly, absolutely. Any way that the government can help disrupt incidents before they happen based on intelligence that it may or is about to happen, that would be helpful to the industry, to all critical infrastructure industries.
Do you or other members of the panel have any indication that there is sometimes cooperation within the victim institution that enables the hackers to gain access?
Insider threat is a typical problem. Most often, insiders within a company are just making inadvertent errors. Others, there are disgruntled employees, and that's pretty common anywhere, whether it's cyber or financial fraud or other issues.
I don't know whether anyone else has anything to add on this topic, but it's one of great interest to me because I think we've devoted insufficient resources and priority to these kinds of attacks, which are threatening, seriously threatening to the health of our nation, not to mention to privacy. Would you agree? I see most heads are shaking in the affirmative, let the record show. Let me ask, in terms of the other aspects that are problematic, as you may know, Cerebral and BetterHelp are mental health startups that share data with social media platforms. In other words, sold or monetized that data. The FTC fined BetterHelp for sharing that healthcare data to profit from targeted advertising. Given the increasing sharing of healthcare data, what kind of privacy and security standards would you think should be enhanced or improved to prevent the abuse of that sharing? I'll ask the panel as a whole.
I would say, Senator, that there's an increasing amount of personal health information that is circulated and not regulated based on wearable technologies and home medical technologies. And there have been groups other than ours that are looking into what kinds of data are being shared that are not under some kind of regulatory scrutiny, and then how do we shore that up? I don't have specific answers on that for you.
Cerebral recently disclosed that it shared personal data of over 3.1 million American patients with TikTok, Facebook, and Google. Obviously, this is not a cyber attack, but it is an attack on the patients. Not an attack as perhaps we would characterize it normally, but it's an attack on their privacy. And I invite you to think more about it and respond in writing if you have any additional ideas. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. It's my opportunity to ask questions next, and Just want to acknowledge that last question or issue that you raised, Senator Blumenthal. I may, in my time, hopefully get to a follow-up question on that, because it may not be a cyber attack, but hugely significant vulnerability that you raise. You know, our healthcare system is uniquely important and vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks and vulnerabilities, and the issue touches all of our constituents. As has been discussed, data breaches and ransomware attacks on healthcare providers and third-party device makers have affected millions of Californians alone. I reviewed the mandatory breach notifications filed with the Department of Health and Human Services, and as of yesterday morning, there are 63 different California-based breaches of unsecured protected health information under investigation, affecting over 90 million people. That's more than 2 times the state's population. So the national scale of the problem is alarming. In addition to the inappropriate disclosure of personal information, any disruption to the systems used in the healthcare and public healthcare settings could be catastrophic for many Americans who rely on their services for care. So I thank Chairman Peters for holding this important hearing. The first question may seem a little basic, it may be a little softball, but I think it's critical for folks that are following this hearing in person and online. Breaches in the healthcare sector allow for the disclosure of patient health information, as well as Social Security, other personal identifiable information, and sensitive information. So I want to be sure that the public appreciates why this information is so sensitive for patients, and why the healthcare sector in particular is such an attractive target for attacks. I'll direct the question to Mr. Martin. Why is personal health information so sensitive and valuable to those who would seek to steal it?
Senator, thank you for your question. Part of what makes healthcare data so sensitive is that it doesn't change, that it is something that continues to grow, but it isn't something that can be reset or changed, like a password or a credit card number or something like that. So once it falls into a bad actor's hands, that information can be used in perpetuity to purport, future, crimes, whether that's, identity theft or blackmail the individual. Those types of things then become possible forever, as opposed to something where an individual could take an action to stop that happening in the future.
Thank you. It's, again, important, I think, to put a spotlight on. Now, according to a report last year from the cybersecurity firm Sophos, 66% of healthcare organizations, 2/3, were hit by ransomware attacks last year. 44% of healthcare organizations suffered an attack in the last year, took up to a week to recover from the most significant attack, and 25% of them took up to a month. I'll direct the question to Mr. Garcia. Can you speak to the specific challenges that healthcare organizations face in recovering from a ransomware attack and the resulting impact on people seeking medical care? And I think a more direct version of the question that Senator Hawley asked vis-a-vis foreign actors, how can the government help reduce the recovery time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Many hospitals that are disrupted by ransomware attacks are unable to schedule appointments. They're unable to perform procedures or surgeries. They have to go to a paper-based environment. Our graduating medical students these days have never seen a pad of prescription paper with a pen. It's all electronic now. So to move to a...
I mean, their penmanship is even worse?
Penmanship is even worse. It's now all thumbs. Getting back online, we actually put together a resource for health systems that have been disabled for an extended period of time. It's called Operational Continuity After a Cyber Incident. And there's many steps that need to be taken to ensure that you appropriately sequence getting infected systems back online so that they're not reinfected. and prioritizing continuity of care to those patients who need it most, and that includes getting your financial systems back online so that you can get reimbursement, so that you don't go into the red and insolvent. Recommendations about what the government can do to help. One of the things we've been discussing and was sort of touched on on this panel is, can there be a strike force from the government that can come in and help with whether it's CISA or HHS to help with reconstituting systems and bringing things back online, doing the forensics and the triage at a cybersecurity level for those smaller systems. And that could include some kind of financial assistance to make sure that that the priority is going to patients while they are bringing systems back online.
Thank you. In my time left, I want to raise one more issue and question. Today there are hundreds of thousands of unfilled vacancies in cybersecurity positions nationwide. Both private and public sector employers face challenges in recruiting personnel, hiring, and retaining professionals to fill these vacancies, which negatively affects our collective cybersecurity. Now, growing talent is a priority under the recently released White House National Cybersecurity Strategy in Congress. Mr. Garcia and Ms. Pierce, can you speak to the specific and unique challenges in the healthcare sector as far as identifying, recruiting, hiring, and retaining IT professionals, and do you have any recommendations for us today?
Well, I can personally, thank you for the questions. I can personally share that recruiting and retaining cybersecurity staff is a daunting task for a small facility. I don't believe that there will be a time when small hospitals will have dedicated cybersecurity staff in-house. I believe moving to a managed service provider type environment where those types of services are outsourced to the people whose business is cybersecurity defenses. Hospitals' main priority is taking care of patients. It's healthcare. That's their mission. It's not cybersecurity. So I believe if we go to a model where those things are more outsourced, it would be beneficial for smaller facilities.
First, do no harm. And I think that is inclusive of protecting somebody's personal and health information. Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Senator Padilla. I really appreciate it. We're all going to build off of each other on these questions, and I really want to thank you all for being here today and for the work you're doing. And so, of course, we're here to talk about healthcare cybersecurity. So as one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, securing the healthcare and public health sector, we know it's critical to protecting our national security for obvious reasons. So the past 3 years, the healthcare data breaches have doubled. And in addition to threatening patient privacy and security, as all of my colleagues have mentioned, these attacks ultimately drive up the cost of healthcare as well, as there have to be more investments made in protecting this data. So last Congress, Senator Cassidy and I introduced the Healthcare Cybersecurity Act. It was bipartisan legislation that would require CISA to coordinate with and make resources available to healthcare entities, including by developing products tailored to the specific needs of small and rural hospitals and health clinics, to what you're speaking to, Ms. Pierce. So you spoke to maybe a task force or separate businesses for ransomware security issues, but Mr. Garcia and then Mr. Dresen, maybe you can speak about how we could maybe, in the meantime, or instead of doing that, or in conjunction, how can we provide cybersecurity training to the healthcare asset owners and operators so that we can empower them to be partners in this instead of just maybe turning it over, that they're engaged and empowered, especially these small and rural hospitals. Like you said, they don't have the capacity to have IT staff, but we want their empowerment and engagement. So if you could speak to that. First, Mr. Garcia and Mr. Dresen.
Certainly. Thank you for that question, Senator. I mentioned previously a resource that the healthcare industry, our council, and HHS together produced called Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices, or HICCUP. which is intended to provide the top 10 cybersecurity best practices that health systems need to implement to be cyber secure. This is a strong partnership between HHS and the sector, and we look to CISA with the technical support. And they have regional cybersecurity advisors all over the country, and they do provide assistance, technical assistance, not just to health systems, but to many other industry sectors. We would like to see them use the hiccup in their engagements with health systems around the country, because CISA does not itself have healthcare expertise, so they need to rely on their sector risk management agency, HHS, as the guiding force for the technical support that CISA should provide. And we believe that the hiccup which is based on the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is by now a de facto standard, that is the best way to provide focused level of controls to the healthcare industry and try to remove some of the noise around of too many choices to implement.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. I would call two examples of opportunities I think could demonstrate how we could be more effective collaborating together. The first is an organization in the state of Michigan called the Michigan Healthcare Cybersecurity Council, and it's an organization that's been together for about 10 years and originated with the sponsorship from the governor's office at the time. And it brought together all the healthcare entities in the state of Michigan to create an environment where we could have a collaborative discussion around cybersecurity issues. We could share best practices. It connected large systems with small systems so that you gave that connectivity and access to expertise to everybody in the state to help improve the state of the healthcare sector overall. And connecting programs like that to CISA, as Mr. Garcia suggested, is an excellent way to connect the knowledge with the ability to deliver that information to the people who most need it. And the other example I would share is an organization in Grand Rapids called the West Michigan Center for Arts and Technology, and they have an innovative program, and Senator Peters had a chance to visit last year, and we thank you, Senator Peters, for you doing that. And it's a program to train diverse students who are interested in entering the cybersecurity field, and is a tuition-free program that puts them through education delivered by a partner entity out of California. They come out of that program with certifications and employability in the cybersecurity field, which enables them to have a living wage for them and their families and provides a well-needed access to talent that is needed in the healthcare sector. And so advocacy for and sponsorship of those types of programs at the federal level can help local entities deliver that talent where it's most needed.
Thank you. Collaboration amongst entities and building the pipeline through apprenticeships. Those are some of my future questions. So we'll collaborate and get the information from Chair Peters. But everyone else is talking about, also we've been talking a lot about our medical device cybersecurity, right? Very important. People have the test for pacemakers, all kinds of things, and you just call in on your phone and they get all of those results. And I did have a bill last year to strengthen medical device cybersecurity. It updated FDA guidance and was included in last year's FDA package and became law as part of the omnibus. And I do hope, in conjunction with the other things we're working on, that this legislation becomes a platform for FDA and CISA to work together going forward. You've spoken a lot about it, but we're beginning to give those tools. But I want to build out a little bit about your, in the minute I have left, Senator Padilla's question and everyone's question is building and expanding our workforce, because there's more than nearly 800,000 cyber jobs. And so in every single sector, they're facing these same challenges. I have introduced a bill with Marsha Blackburn, so Cyber Ready Workforce Act is to surge up capacity with the Department of Labor to award grants to increase access to things like a registered apprenticeship program that's going to lead to an industry-recognized certification, encourage those stackable and portable credentials so people can get into the system. And so, Mr. Garcia, I guess since Mr. Dresen already talked about it, can you explain how we could improve and expand these apprenticeship programs through a public-private partnership, through a community college that will really help get people working in the industry, and then they can move up where they need to?
There are lots of ideas to that effect, and one that could even be modeled on the medical profession itself. That is, there's a loan forgiveness or some other kind of subsidies for medical students when they go into small to rural settings, that they will be forgiven some medical medical
I
school
have some
debt.
of that legislation myself. I've sponsored.
That's perfect. And the same can be done for cybersecurity. And we have that with the National Security Agency, Centers for Academic Excellence in Cybersecurity, scholarship for service by National Science Foundation. There are various ways that we can incentivize students to study cybersecurity and then go into the workforce where it's most needed and get some level of compensation for that.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. Chair, you're back. Chair Peters, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Sinema, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to witnesses for joining us today. Last year, when Yuma Regional Medical Center fell victim to a ransomware attack, 700,000 patients were notified that their personal health data had been stolen. But when a hospital is hacked, it's not just Arizona-sensitive data that's placed at risk. Particularly in rural communities where alternative hospitals may not be available, crippling cyber attacks can literally be matters of life and death. This is also true in other healthcare contexts. Last year, the National Suicide Hotline was brought offline by a cyber attack, resulting in an entire day where Arizonans facing mental health emergencies could not call 988 and receive the support they needed. So my first question is for Mr. Dresen. Imagine looking in the eyes of a parent whose child may have called the suicide hotline on December 1st, but wasn't able to get through due to the cyber attack. I'm committed to ensuring that our nation's suicide prevention system is better prepared for the next attack. So the question for you is, what lessons should other public health stakeholders take from the hack on the 988 lifeline?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. It's unfortunate the event on the 988 attack was a sobering reminder of the impact to critical healthcare services when cyber attacks have successful outcomes. It reminds us all of the importance of being very aware of the risks we face as a healthcare sector to deliver those services, the need to have an adequately funded and staffed team that can implement the protections to protect us, and the understanding that we can only do so much to protect us and can't eliminate all risk. And so it requires the partnership of the government to help us provide additional protections, increasing risk and consequences for those who attack us, and the understanding and the support when we are attacked that we're the victims, and help us work through that process and don't penalize us for being attacked.
Thank you. Ms. Pierce, a few years ago, hackers took Wickenburg Community Hospital, the only hospital in a small Arizona community, offline. Fortunately, the talented IT team in Wickenburg had backed up the hospital's data and then worked around the clock to quickly rebuild their system from scratch. But not all community hospitals or other rural or tribal healthcare providers are so fortunate. Many simply do not have the resources or the cybersecurity expertise to quickly recover. So given your experience with the rural health system, can you discuss some of the unique cybersecurity challenges that are facing smaller hospitals?
Thank you for the question. I think that smaller hospitals have a varying degree of ability to recover from those attacks. One of the things that's imperative is that the attacks are identified and remediated quickly. So I'm not aware of the particular attack you're speaking of, but I would imagine that they identified quickly that there was an issue, took things offline immediately, and were able to restore from backup. Many times cyber attackers have been within the network and been able to not only compromise existing systems, but have also compromised the backups. So the challenges can be extensive in recovery to that. And we've seen some health systems, even larger systems, take weeks, if not months, to recover. So I would say that there's no one answer to that. It's there's just a wide range of abilities and talent within rural communities, and I think that your particular hospital was the exception, not the rule, when it comes to cyber attacks.
Thank you. Mr. Garcia, today ransomware attacks against hospitals are mostly financially motivated, but tomorrow cyber attacks may target specific patients with the intent to kill or injure them. As more Arizonans receive wireless medical device implants, the possibility that a hacker could disable a pacemaker or manipulate an insulin pump is something we need to take seriously. So how could public and private sectors get ahead of this threat and ensure that wireless medical devices meet the most rigorous cybersecurity standards?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Senator. There is a lot of work being done in ensuring the security of a variety of connected medical devices, wireless and wired and otherwise. The idea of pacemakers and such. The one issue about that is it is one of those low probability, high impact kinds of events. You have to be right next to somebody with a phone to actually communicate with the pacemaker. I think what we can...
Right now.
Yes, right now. And what we're concerned about, however, is a much broader attack where patient data can be corrupted in a much broader scale within a hospital system, so that anybody who is being treated in the hospital can be given the wrong dose of medicine or the wrong treatment based on corrupted data about their specific patient data. That's the much higher risk that we need to be concerned about. Meanwhile, the medical device industry, through the Sector Coordinating Council, is working hard to develop standards of practice for how you design, develop, manufacture cybersecurity into medical devices, connected wirelessly, Bluetooth, whatever, from the ground up, so that they are secure by design. That is an ongoing and long-term program that the medical device community is acutely aware of.
Thank you. Mr. Dresen, if a ransomware attack affects an emergency room, even if we're able to restore those systems within 1 hour, some patients may not live that long. So this sense of urgency incentivizes hospitals to pay ransoms to hackers, something, of course, that the FBI and CISA advise against. Although paying may protect specific patients and hospitals in the short term, it also, of course, guarantees and perhaps incentivizes that hackers will continue targeting hospitals in the future. So how do you believe that hospitals should navigate the decision of whether or not to pay a ransom? And how can the federal government help hospitals enhance their cyber attack prevention and mitigation capabilities so that the question of whether to pay or not to pay becomes irrelevant?
It's our policy to align with the FBI guidance to not pay ransomware, and so we do everything we can to mitigate the risk that that's going to happen. We do that by evaluating the risks we have to our organization of a cyber attack, making investments with our leadership support to ensure we have protections in place to reduce the likelihood that that's going to happen. So the support we can gain from the government to help further mitigate that risk is improved threat intelligence sharing that's actionable and near real time, so we can have the most up-to-date information available to us to help protect us, as well as, again, reinforcing educational programs that can help train qualified staff that we can have work with us to ensure we can implement the best practice recommendations to protect our organization.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. I would like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today and for your contributions to what is a very important conversation. As we heard today, cyber attacks against our healthcare sector can result in tragic consequences and can cause serious disruptions to patients' lives. As chairman of this committee, I have worked on a bipartisan basis to significantly strengthen our nation's cybersecurity, and I hope that we can build on those efforts by making sure the federal government can provide additional support for our most frequent targets of ransomware, including the healthcare sector. I urge my colleagues to join me in these efforts to ensure our nation can continue to combat these threats and build resiliency into our critical infrastructure. Our witnesses' testimony today will help inform the committee's future legislative activity as well as oversight on this issue. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on March 31st of 2023 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.